അഞ്ചു സൂര്യൻ. എൻ ചോരയിലുണ്ടൊരു സൂര്യൻ, കുങ്കുമഗന്ധം വിതറി ചെങ്കനൽ ചുറ്റും ചിതറി കത്തും തരുണാരുണ ചഞ്ചല സൂര്യൻ. എൻ കൺകളിലുണ്ടൊരു സൂര്യൻ, നീലിമയിമയിൽ നിവർത്തി നീലപ്പീലി വിളുർത്തി നൃത്തം ചെയ്യും പേലവ നീലസൂര്യൻ. എൻ അസ്ഥിയിലുണ്ടൊരു സൂര്യൻ, മഞ്ഞജ്വാലയൊഴുക്കി മജ്ജയുരുക്കിയുരുക്കി മങ്ങിത്തെളിയുമൊരിത്തിരി മഞ്ഞസൂര്യൻ. എൻ നാഡിയിലുണ്ടൊരു സൂര്യൻ, പുണ്ണുപിടിച്ചു വെളുത്തും കണ്ണിമ കൂടി നരച്ചും കൂനി വിറച്ചു വിളർത്തു തളർന്നൊരു വെള്ളസൂര്യൻ. എൻ പ്രാണനിലുണ്ടൊരു സൂര്യൻ, മരണം പോലെ കറുത്തും മഞ്ഞുകണക്കു തണുത്തും ശൂന്യതയുടെ ഗന്ധം താവിയ ശ്യാമള സൂര്യൻ.
Professor Satchidanandan is one of the most important public intellectuals of our time. Primarily a Malayalam poet, he has published extensively in English and Malayalam. He's been writing since the 1960s, and he's written on a host of subjects, both poetry as well as literary criticism. He's also translated a lot of world literature into Malayalam, and also from Malayalam into English. And he has also been extensively commenting on public affairs, both in English and Malayalam. Here we have sir with us to speak to Sarpedia. Thank you so much, sir, for spending this time with us for Sarpedia. Let me start with the formative years. You grew up in a village near Kodunallur. The site itself is very interesting, and it is a very interesting time. Newly independent India, Kerala was being constituted. So what were the formative influences of that time when you started writing?
Well, in fact, I started writing in a way while I was in school. I said in a way because I do not take that very seriously now. I didn't have any poet predecessors in my family, except that my elder brother used to write at that point of time, even though later he stopped writing. I grew up in a village which I think had a major formative influence on my writing, because the memories of the village keep coming back to my poetry, and those keep inspiring me even now. I go back to my childhood, I go back to the nature of the village. So there was that kind of a kind of Wordsworthian atmosphere in the village, because I used to swim in our pond and then pick flowers, climb little hills in the village, and so I grew up in harmony with nature, which I think has stayed with me. And later maybe it grew into a kind of interest in the environment in general. I studied in very ordinary schools, government schools, lower primary, and then a management upper primary school, and then a government high school in Kodunallur, where I had to cross a river and go to the school. But the reading that I did in my childhood, again, I think has stayed with me. We had 2 libraries in the village at that time. That was the time when the library movement in Kerala was quite dynamic, and libraries were coming up in every little town and village. So there was one library which was very close to our home, and there was another which was close to my school. And there were, of course, the school libraries, which also I used occasionally. But mostly my readings were done in those libraries. And I grew up reading, of course, the original works by the writers who were famous at that time, because that was the time when modernism had not really entered Malayalam literature. So I read, Thakazhi and Keshav, and also the poets like Vailapulli, Idashedi Govindan Nair, G. Shankarakurup. And then the 3 famous poets of the time, P. Bhaskaran, O.N.V. Kurup, and Vailar. That reading, along with the readings of translations of great poetry and great fiction, especially Indian fiction, had a lot of impact on me. Not only Indian fiction, I would say, because Russian fiction, for example, was extremely popular at that time. So I read Tolstoy and Dostoevsky and Turgenev, all these in translations. I read all those major, Bengali novels in translation, as every Malayali of my time must have done. And indeed poetry, especially Tagore's poetry, in the beautiful translations done by G. Shankarakurup, was another influence, because Tagore, as we all know, had a great range and variety in his poetry. And I believe that Shankarakurup was able to capture the beauty and the nuances, both of his language and the whole world that he created, and his vision in his translations. That is one of my earliest memories of reading poetry. Even though perhaps there was another memory which goes further back, that was of reading the Malayalam Ramayana, the Adhyatma Ramayana, written by Thunjat Ezhuthachan. As you know, this like all the Ramayanas in the languages, this was not a translation. It was a kind of transcreation of the original Adhyatma Ramayana, where the poet used his own imagination, and he created his own landscapes, and he gave his own colors to the various characters, as all the Ramayana writers did. But the reading of Ramayana was, in fact, my first major experience of what poetry is and what poetry could be, because he used meters with reference to particular context. He had a great command over Malayalam language, and of course he is supposed to be the very creator of modern Malayalam language. The way he used meters, the way he described wars, described love, described the absolute despair and dilemma of Rama as a character, all these have stood with me, and I have been going back to Ramayana very often and finding newer and newer meanings. Looking at Rama also as a tragic figure who always was caught in a dilemma between his love for his wife and power, and this kind of contradiction between love and power has been, again, one of the themes I have been exploring in my poetry in various ways. So Ramayana and Tagore's poetry, particularly Gitanjali, and also the Ego Tarshadi, the 101 poems that G. Shankar translated. So they remain two of the major influences on my poetry, I would say, even today, even though in very oblique and indirect ways. And then in school I began to write. I had some wonderful teachers. I remember particularly a Malayalam Vidwan called Neelakantha Das, who was the father of one of my late friends, T.N. Joy. He had retired from the high school, and then joined the upper primary school where I was a student. And he again introduced me to various important Malayalam poets, and also taught me the elements of poetry, the elements of the craft of poetry. And then, going to Christ College to do my degree, again developed my love for reading, because that was where I read some of the major masterpieces of European fiction and European poetry, and also, of course, a lot of Indian poetry and Indian fiction, and some theory. And that was also because it was a Christian college, maybe. I also read the Bible very closely. I read so many things, but I don't have time to go into all that. But Bible and Shakespeare, these were the two major things, again, that I read while I was a graduate student, that again have remained with me. The Bible moved me deeply, as deeply as perhaps only Mahabharata has done. The ideals of Jesus Christ, the idea of compassion, of charity, of equality, the kind of great cosmic vision that Jesus had, and all those fascinating stories of the prodigal son, and many of those stories in the parables in the Bible, some of which I have used in my poetry. All these fascinated me a lot. And also the poetic parts of the Bible, like the Psalms of David, and some parts of Revelation, which one can say today are quite surrealistic. So these gave me certain ideas about forms, and also gave me a kind of vision of human life, which again has been a lasting influence on me. And then I spent a whole vacation reading all the works of Shakespeare, all his plays. I took notes on each of the plays, and I read all the poems of Shakespeare, the Lycidas, and all the sonnets, which much later I translated all the sonnets of Shakespeare. So Shakespeare again gave me an ideal of what a poet should be. I mean, the range, his great comprehension of life, his insight into the contradictions of life, his intuitive understanding of relationships, and his continuous resistance to forms of power and forms of corruption, which is particularly reflected in his historical plays. So these again gave me great lessons in poetry, even though he was primarily a playwright. But I would say his plays are also primarily poetry, and also the way he used words, the way he combined them, the way he summed up things, and reflected on the contradictions of existence, the anguish of living and being. These continue to haunt me, and these, even now they continue to haunt me, and I keep going back to Shakespeare again, like I keep going back to the Bible. And another influence that came when I was a postgraduate student in Maharaja's College in Ernakulam was the reading of Dhammapada, Buddha's Dhammapada. So I have always said that the Bible and the Dhammapada have been two of the major influences on my writing and my vision of life. But if you ask me what is the epic that has deeply impacted me, it is certainly Mahabharata, more than Ramayana. Ramayana has had its impact, as I said earlier, but Mahabharata, again, I think it's an unparalleled kind of epic whose range can't be compared to any other epic in the world. Whatever I have read, including Iliad and Odyssey and Divine Comedy and other epics, because you have every facet of human life, every pain and every pleasure and every contradiction that human being suffers from in the Mahabharata. So that is again a text that continues to inspire me in many ways. Sometimes it also helps me interpret what is happening today, because Mahabharata has that kind of an appeal, because it is not a book that belongs to some past age, but it's a book that is always contemporary. It travels with us. It helps us understand what is happening around us, for example, in today's politics. So that way, I have written a poem also called Mahabharata, which I wrote in 2013, which unfortunately happened to be ominous. So these are some of the major books that have in some way influenced me, even though after that I have been reading all the major European classics and almost all the major poets whom most of us know. And it was when I was a postgraduate student again that Malayalam literature began to enter what has been called the modernist phase. Even though now I have my own doubts about using words like modernism and postmodernism and all that, because now I have come to think more and more that modernism is not a movement that belongs to a particular period, but a quality of poetry. So I find Kabir absolutely modern, contemporary. I find Mahabharata, something modern. So what we call classics ultimately have an element which I would call modernity today. But that was a period anyway when modernism entered as a kind of movement in Malayalam literature. We had fiction writers like O.V. Vijayan and Kakanadan and M. Mukundan and other people, and we had poets like Ayyappa Panikar and many others, N.N. Kakad and other people who came along with him. But I need to mention Panikar particularly because he was something of a guru to me in the real sense of the term. I met him first when I was an MA student. By the time he had written some of his well-known poems like Kurukshetram And just then, and when I met him, his Mrityu Puja, the hymn to death, had been published in Madhubhumi Weekly. And Panikkar has remained, a major kind of teacher and guide to me all through in my reading, in my writing, and because we always corresponded. Even when he was in the US, I would get a letter, at least one letter every week from him, and he continued to be a major influence on my poetry, and the kind of diversity and the variety you find in my poetry, I believe, has come to a great extent from Panikkar, because he also experimented with the different kinds of forms, metrical forms, different kinds of prose, various tones of ordinary speech and of writing. So this kind of tendency to experiment, the tendency to always remain a part of the avant-garde, that in some sense was taught to me by Dr. Ayyappa Panikkar.
In the 1960s, that's the time when you Stranger and some of your earlier works were published then. And 60s was also a period where lots of social events are happening, the splits in communist parties happening, Nehruvian India, the disillusionment sets in. You were writing a very intense, personalized, one could call existentialist poetry.
Yeah.
So when you look back at the 1960s, how do they speak to you?
Yeah, in the 1960s, as I said, the modernist kind of poetry that was being written, and not only poetry but fiction and other things that, which were being written not only in Malayalam but in other Indian languages too, had a great impact on me. And that was essentially a poetry of disillusionment. I said essentially because when I look back, I find that it was not exactly so. Even Panikkar, even when he was writing poems addressed to death and all, or poems like Kurukshetra, which are poems of the great existential dilemma, also wrote poems addressing the morning or addressing the sun or addressing fire. So he had great poems of hope too. But it was that the tragic element in modernism, that kind of disillusionment in modernism, that fascinated me as a very young man, because that was also the time when politically, on the one hand, there was hope. There was this Nehruvian hope of a new India, which was hoped to be an egalitarian and independent India, an India where liberalism would really flourish. So there was hope, but there was also despair, because there was a retreat of Gandhian values from politics. Politicians were beginning to be corrupt. Well, there were people of integrity like Nehru himself, but if you looked at the common politician around you, you would find that many of them were in some sense corrupt or power hungry. And the hopes that especially the poor people had were not exactly, they were not able to realize those hopes. So there was also this kind of a disappointment with what I can call a real politic, and a disappointment with the failures of the kind of many dream projects that visionaries like Nehru had. So I shared as a young person at that time also that hopelessness, and that might have been one of the reasons for that. And secondly, subjectively, there was some inexplicable kind of sadness in me. I used to sit alone when I was in the Maharaja's College. I would sit on the banks of the backwaters and sometimes look at the sunset and weep. So there was a kind of sad person in me. There was a kind of instinctive melancholy in me, which of course I later overcame with hard work and with a lot of hope. But then that was the time when, yes, I was a kind of sad young man, and all this the sadness that surrounded me, the social kind of sorrow that surrounded me, also impacted my poetry in a way. So the disillusionment of the modernist poetry in general, my subjective despair, and the social despair, all these contributed to the kind of grief and disillusionment that you may find in some of my
You were also reading a lot of M.N. Roy, Sartre, etc.
Yes, yeah, that is another part of my, that is part of my intellectual autobiography. Poetry, I was reading a lot of modern Western poetry, British, American and European. I was reading the French symbolists like Baudelaire and Mallarmé and Rimbaud and similar other poets. I was also reading T.S. Eliot, which is also part of our curriculum, and Auden and Spender and all those other modernists. And then I was reading some of the contemporary writers and some writers who went before them, like Kafka. It was during that time I read Kafka and was deeply impressed by the dark and morbid world that Kafka opened before me. His America, The Trial, The Castle, and stories like Metamorphosis. And then I was reading Sartre, because Sartre was a major kind of cult figure in those days. I bought almost every book by Sartre, all those plays like, The Sequestration of Altona, The Flies, and all those plays, and then all the three novels of the trilogy like Reprieve and all that, and then his Being and Nothingness, and Existentialism as Humanism, and all the major works of Sartre, which I read. And I also wrote on Sartre. I wrote a series of 10 articles on Sartre and published them in Malayalam in a monthly, which is no more, called Kerala Digest. So that was the first introduction to Malayalis also. I mean, Malayalis who are not familiar with Sartre, to Sartre and his major works. And then I was also reading, of course, you can imagine the kind of conflicts I must have gone through, because I was reading three very different kinds of things. I was reading Marx. The Communist Manifesto, the various works of Marx and Engels, and I was guided very much by a professor called Bharathan, who was a professor of political science and who had many MAs in all kinds of subjects. Then I was reading M.N. Roy, who originally was a Marxist and who later became a radical humanist. I was reading his works like New Humanism and Beyond Revolution, the book on Revolution and Renaissance, and various other works of M.N. Roy. So that was a time of turbulence, in fact, a kind of spiritual turbulence, when several strains of thinking coexisted in my mind, and they were fighting one another, and I was trying to understand what was right and what was wrong. So I wouldn't say I arrived at any conclusion at that point of time. So I was doing different kinds of things, which perhaps contradicted one another, but which perhaps also had something in common, as I now find when I look back. Because all the three, if you finally look at them, Roy and Marx, and Sartre, all the three were humanists, and there was this the core of humanism in all the three philosophical streams, and that is what ultimately has stayed with me and influenced me as a thinker, even though I don't claim to be a thinker in any large sense of the term. Whatever thinking guides me, that's what I mean. So in fact now I have come to a stage where I am beginning to learn to reconcile systems of thought which I once had thought were contradictory. For example, Gandhi, Ambedkar and Marx. A lot of people have pitted one against the other. Ambedkarites don't like Gandhi. Gandhians say Marx advocated violence, which he never did, by the way. And so they have always been looked at as contradictory, thinkers who contradicted one another. But now, when I read late Marx, for example, his New York Tribune articles, and the later editions of Das Kapital, which he rewrote during his last days, and all the later studies he made of Asian culture and of slavery, especially in the slavery of the blacks, I find that he was coming very close to Gandhi, because he no more clung to, because there was no single Marx, as we very well know, as there was no single Gandhi either. So he was evolving to the very end, and he now said that it is not the proletariat that is the only revolutionary class. These slaves how the potential revolutionaries in them. He learned it from the American Civil War, a hard lesson. So there he found potential radicals in the black slaves, in the primitive kind of workers in Asian countries, along with the industrial laborers. So it was not the urban white laborer who was going to liberate the black slave, but the black slave would liberate himself or herself. And he had come to that towards the end, and this is something that very few Marxists. But today I am rediscovering Marx. And I mean I was influenced by early Marx at one particular time, and then by middle Marx, and now I find late Marx even more relevant. And if you read late Marx, you won't find so many contradictions between Ambedkar and Gandhi either, because Ambedkar's idea of the annihilation of caste, the Ambedkar's identification of caste with class to a great extent, like Fanon said in The Wretched of the Earth, to be black is to be poor. And that was the idea that Ambedkar also to a great extent had. And Gandhi's idea of Swaraj, of liberation from the grassroots, and the dream of self-sustaining communities who would themselves decide what they should do and how they should govern themselves, and what mode of development would suit them. So these ideas ultimately are not contradictory as it has often been presented, but they often complement one another. And perhaps at a very, very critical time like this, we need to reread Gandhi and Ambedkar and Marx in our own way, and try to create a creative and very positive way of looking at things and reshaping our understanding of politics, our understanding of social reality, and our understanding of the struggle for a free and democratic India.
Before, you spoke in detail about Gandhi, but there is a period that perhaps is the real rupture. You're finding your voice.
In a sense.
Multi-layered.
Yeah, I would say that that was my second collection. That poem appeared in my second collection, because my first collection was very, very amateur. Even today I am sometimes amateurish, but then my first collection I would still consider very amateurish, because I was experimenting, trying different kinds of things and tones and meters and all that. But as you very rightly said, I believe that I began to find my own voice in the second volume of my poems, where this particular poem on
a lot of the themes which you
also
later developed,
appears.
Which you find in your poetry.
Many of those themes and many of those modes, later got developed in my later collections and all that.
It's also a poem about writing poetry itself, situating education at the center of.
Yes, it is a poem on creativity. It's a poem on it is not a poem on Ramayana in that sense. It's a poem on the act of creativity, how about inspiration, about that particular moment that burns you down, and from which you resurrect, and from which ultimately your poem also comes alive. So it is my attempt to understand this whole act of creativity, which sometimes, like a whirlwind that seems to affect you and take you to places that you had never dreamt of, and makes you use language in ways that you had never thought of before. So I was trying to understand that strange tempest called poetic creativity.
But maybe for the next few years, and one particular strand in that poem is this question of justice. You take up characters like Shurpanakha and specifically talk about justice.
Yes.
And it's that strand, perhaps, which you find in Pani or Satyavan Moolam, all those very major poems of 1970s. This is the strand which you seem to be lingering on. So when you look back at those poems,
I can connect those poems even with my earlier poems in the first collection. There is a poem on Vietnam, for example, because Vietnam War was it was something that deeply moved all of us, because it was a small people, a small nation fighting against a huge power, and then finally winning. So of course that poem Vietnam is like a nightmare. But the war had and the war and the sense of justice and the moral battle that was at the core of that war had moved me and many of my friends very deeply. And so one can trace, perhaps, what I'm saying is my poems of the 70s to a poem like the Vietnam and a poem like the one you suggested, and some of the later poems I wrote, like the Tree of Justice and the Pulaya songs and the Paraya song and various
all
kinds
those
of
poems in Indian,
those
Indian
poems.
speeches.
Many of those folk things I tried. I tried them mainly because that was the time when we were also reading poetry, not very often in very elite, to very elite audiences, but to ordinary people. And behind all those poems of the 70s, mainly there is this idea of justice, which is more than a personal idea of justice, but an idea or a larger idea of social justice, and an idea of love, which again is not an idea, not a romantic idea of love, but a larger love about which today Antonio Negri and quite a lot of new Marxist thinkers have begun to speak, because they have brought back the word love into their thought, the Marxist thinking, into their revolutionary thinking, and they use love in this particular sense, something that bonds all the oppressed together, and they call that love. In that sense, that kind of love and that sense of justice, both these had ultimately inspired all those poems of the 70s, which endeared me to quite a lot of young people of that time, and many of them want to remember me by those poems, even though I would not like them to forget those poems, but I would like them also to look at the poems I wrote later.
Mentioned love in the context of revolution. There is, I think, the departure from that 70s poem, maybe that the great poem where you speak about, there is a paragraph where you talk about people talking about revolution without karuna in their heart.
Exactly. Very true. Yeah, that was again a major poem. I'm not speaking about the quality of poetry, but in the evolution of my poetry, that was a major break, because that was the time when the People's Cultural Forum had broken down. The Marxist-Leninist movement itself, it had, it was split, and there were so many sections and all that. Many, including some of my friends and students, committed suicide. Some really literally went mad. There were quite a few. I remember Sanal Das. I remember Subramanya Das, who was my own very dear student, who committed suicide. So there were many like that. That was a tragic time, because there was great hope in all of them that inspired all of them to fight, to join the revolutionary ranks and fight. But finally they found, revolution was somewhere in a very distant horizon, and they were not going to see it in their lifetime. And that created a kind of impossible disillusionment and darkness. And that affected me also very deeply. And I have very often said, had I not been a poet, I would not have survived that crisis. Because it was such a dark time when I felt we had no hope at all, no hope of salvation at all. But how did I find that hope again? Because this particular poem, that once again I become alone, has this despair, and also ultimately towards the end it has also a kind of hope. As you very well said, it is also inspired by that idea of compassion. And how can there be a revolution without this basic compassion? The idea of compassion I always connect with Buddha and Dhammapada. I go back to it again and again. So I found that many of these comrades with whom I had some intimate relationships in those days, because who used to come to my home, and we used to have, spend nights talking about what to do. But I found many of them extremely dry theorists, and who did not act, they were not moved by love and compassion, but some kind of a very dry, inhuman idea of revolution and power and all that. And I found that there was perhaps little distinction between the power mongers I found all around, and some of them who also thought that one day they would also become, Stalins or Pol Pots or worse people. So that was a point of break. For me, with that movement, and also there was this breakdown of the whole political movement and the cultural movement, and a period of despair. But then I found that new movements were coming up all around. There was the Dalit movement. I was the first to translate the Marathi Dalit poems, of course, from English into Malayalam. The poems by Namdev Tasal and Raja Thale and all those major Dalit poets. Much before Dalit poetry was known in Malayalam. Yeah, I published those translations in some magazine called Chitra Kartika. I was also translating the Digambara poets, Digambara Kavalu of Andhra. And so there were movements coming up. There were workers' movements and peasants' movements coming up, even outside the Marxist-Leninist movement, like the railway workers' strike and the port workers' strike, which almost stilled the whole country. And then there were women's movements coming up, women's liberation. The idea was slowly catching up, and there were small groups discussing women's liberation. So these new uprisings, what I could call new movements, independent autonomous movements in some sense, the Dalit movement, the women's movement, the new movements of the peasants and the laborers, which were not always connected with political parties. So they gave me a kind of new hope and gave also a new direction to my thinking. And during all these periods, I was also editing journals. All this went hand in hand. I don't find any contradiction. In the magazines I edited during the time, the articles I wrote, the poetry I wrote, the translations I made, somehow they all fall into place because all of them somehow united my own divided self. So I had originally run an avant-garde magazine called Jwala, and now I started a new journal called Uttaram, which means an answer. Not that I was giving answers, but I was looking for an answer. So that was a magazine of new thinking, which where, for example, I went back to Antonio Gramsci and Rosa Luxemburg and other Marxist thinkers who were not necessarily Leninists, who had even problems with Lenin, like Rosa Luxemburg, who argued for a democratic Soviet Union and not a dictatorship. So I went back to those thinkers and also other, various Lucio Colletti and Althusser and quite a few other thinkers who were coming up in the left tradition, but not traditional Marxists in that sense. So I was reading them, and this magazine was a kind of platform for that kind of new Marxist thinking and also other forms of new movements that were coming up. So that saved me partly, and also, as I said, I was able to express my pain in poems like this one, that finally I am alone. So because being able to express oneself is a major way of surviving those absolute moments of despair that might drive somebody even into suicide. So I think many of us who had the ability to write somehow managed to survive.